Today's daf is daf kuf, and we're up to Amalei Meremar on the top of the Omut, the Itema Rav Yemar. So these are Amoraim that are discussing with Mar Zutra the issue of a brisa, and the question was whether this brisa is reliable or not. That's what we learned on Daf Tzadi Tesam Beis, a brisa that was very problematic because the brisa seemed to indicate that a person should not be eating on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif from 9.5 hours and on, such that he should enter into Shabbos or Yontif litava with a te'avon, and that was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yossi said, "Ochel veholech ad shetechshach," that you're allowed to eat on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif, whenever you want. Start your meal whenever it's convenient for you. And it would seem in the Brisa that Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said it's also to begin a meal at that time, which is Teisha Umechza Samach L'Mincha. And Rabbi Yossi denies it. So Mar Zutra was the one who said that the Brisa, meaning the first Brisa, is reliable. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontiv, you're not allowed to begin a meal Samach L'Zmana Mincha. And maybe this second Brisa is Mishubeshes. It's not a reliable Brisa. And the Gemara now asks, "Ana ikla lepirkei Rav Pinchas b'rei Rav Ami v'kom tana v'tani kamei." I was at one point at the drasha of Rabbi Pinchas, and one of the Chachamim stood up and taught this brisa b'kibla minei, and the brisa said mitesha shos ulamala. And Rabbi Pinchas accepted the brisa. He didn't question the reliability of the brisa. And that proves that the brisa is a reliable brisa. So we cannot accept Mar Zutra's answer that the brisa is what we call Mishu Beshes. But now that the Gemara rejected Mar Zutra, now we get back to our original question, Ihachi Kasha. If the brisa is indeed reliable as we have it, then we have a problem. Because, as Rav Papa said, our Mishnah reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore we're stuck with the following question. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, why does our Mishnah mention Erev Pesach when every Erev Yontif it's also, according to Rabbi Yehuda, to eat Mina Mincha Ulamala? And it would seem that the Brisa says explicitly that on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif, Rabbi Yehuda prohibits eating Samach L'Mincha, and therefore Erev Pesach is identical with every Erev Yontif. So that we no longer have an answer to the question why our Mishnah singles out Erev Pesach, when if the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda holds that every Erev Shabbos, every Erev Yontif, it's asur to start a meal Samach L'Mincha at 9.5 hours. Why did our Mishnah mention the Isser of Samach L'Mincha with regard to Erev Pesach? It's a universal halacha. There's no extra chidush in Erev Pesach. It applies to every Erev Yontif, every Erev Shabbos. The Gemara answers, Machvarta, the right answer is not Rav Papa's answer, but Kid Rav Huna. That our Mishnah that generates an Isur of Achila Samach L'Mincha, and it's Dafkan Erev Pesach, that reflects not the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, but rather Shita Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is the one who says, Ochel Ad Shetechshach, that there's no Isur to eat on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif. But Pesach is different because of the mitzvah of matzah. Now the Gemara asks the Kachel Rav Huna, Minicha, are we in the clear if we interpret our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yossi? V'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'tema Amar Avo, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda b'erev Pesach, halacha k'Rabbi Yossi b'erev Shabbos. From this statement, we can derive the conclusion that there was a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, not only with regard to Erev Yontif in general, but even with regard to Erev Pesach. Just that this tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan has it that we paskin lechumra with regard to Pesach, and we accept the shita Rabbi Yehuda that we're not allowed to eat samach lemincha on Erev Pesach. We don't accept the chumra of Rabbi Yehuda as far as Erev Shabbos is concerned, but rather we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. But halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda Erev Pesach michlal dipolig Rabbi Yossi b'travayu. There was a double machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi is mekil even in the case of Erev Pesach. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan had to say, halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda b'erev Pesach. So again, in our Mishnah that says that it's also to eat samach lemincha couldn't be that's Rabbi Yossi. So we're back to a difficulty on Rav Huna. The Gemara says, lo, that which the Amoraim, let's call it Rabbi Yochanan Paskin, halacha Rabbi Yehuda on Erev Pesach, which seems to imply that Rabbi Yossi never accepted it. Halacha Michal de Pligi, you have to understand that when Rabbi Yochanan said halacha, we pass like Rabbi Yehuda on Erev Pesach, which implies that Rabbi Yossi disagrees, it wasn't as far as the issue of the Isra Achila on Erev Pesach. Even Rabbi Yossi agrees that you're not allowed to start a meal Erev Pesach samach lemincha, but rather the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is in terms of hafsaka, which means that let's say he began his eating beheter at an earlier time, and now the machlokas is going to be whether or not we allow him to continue since he started his meal beheter, as we're going to explain it in just a minute. And with regard to this machlokas, and Rabbi Yossi was mekil even on Erev Pesach, but not only in the case where you're not allowed to eat, but even in the case, but on the contrary, in a case where you are allowed to eat because you started your meal earlier before the Shasa Isur, that's where Rabbi Yossi held that even though it's Erev Pesach, we're going to allow him to continue. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says that even though you started your meal beheter, once the Shas Isur comes, it's 9.5 hours, it's samach lemincha, you have to stop. And you have to terminate your meal because you're not allowed to be eating at that time. So Rabbi Yossi says that the Isur is an Isur hascholas hasuda. And Rabbi Yehuda holds it's an Isur achila per se. And here's where Rabbi Yochanan paskins like Rabbi Yehuda lechumra with regard to Erev Pesach, that even if you started your meal beheter, nevertheless mafsikin. And now the Gemara is going to quote the original machlokes, the source in a brisa, a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi about afsaka. The Sanya we learned in a brisa, this is a Tosefta in the 5th parak of Brachos, mafsikin l'shabbosos, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you began to eat on Erev Shabbos, beheter, before the time of samach lemincha, and now you're continuing your meal and it's nighttime, immediately with nighttime, with nightfall, you have to terminate your meal. Now, what does it mean to terminate a meal? It's not enough that he recite Kiddush because it's now Friday night and then continue his meal, but rather he has to separate between the meal that he started as a Suda Schol and the meal, the Suda that he's obligated now with the onset of Shabbos as a Suda Shabbos. How does he do so? Number one, it's called Akiras Shulchan. In the old days, they used to eat each individual on his own small table. So you have to remove the table, then you have to recite Kiddush, and then you make Birkas HaMazon to terminate the Suda that you began on Chol, the Suda's Chol. Now, there are 2 points that are discussed here in the later commentaries, and that is, why do we need Akiras HaShulchan before Kiddush? I mean, after all, why isn't it enough that he just recite Kiddush and then bench? So Tama Davar, the reason why he needs Akiras Shulchan is because of halacha that Kiddush tzarich lios b'shah shulchan eino lefanav. The law is that we bring out the Shulchan after Kiddush, not before, as we'll soon learn on Daf Kuf Amid Beis. So therefore, in order to recite Kiddush, the first thing you need to do is Akiras Shulchan. Now, why is it that first he benches and then he recites Birkas Hamazon? Why not recite Birkas Hamazon? I'm sorry. Why is it that first he recites Kiddush, I meant to say, and then Birkas Hamazon? Why not the reverse? Start with Birkas Hamazon, terminate your Sudas Chol, and then begin a Sudas Shabbos with Kiddush. Tama Dover, Shemakadesh Kodem Birkas Hamazon, Sha'achar Birkas Hamazon yeh also lishtos sakos Birkas Hamazon Kodem Kiddush. We have to recite Birkas Hamazon ala kos, and if he would start with Birkas Hamazon before Kiddush, then he would not be able to drink from the kos of Birkas Hamazon. He's only allowed to drink that kos after Kiddush, because once the Shas Kiddush is chal, there's an iser of Achila and Shasir. In any event, this is Rabbi Yehuda Shita Mafsikin l'Shabbos, and Rabbi Yossi Omer Ein Mafsikin. So Rabbi Yossi says you're not allowed to begin your meal on Erev Pesach Samach L'Mincha, and that's because mitzvah of matzah is d'oraisa, and you have to eat it l'teyavon. However, if you began to eat your meal before Samach L'Mincha, when it was heter, then Rabbi Yossi allows you to continue your meal on Erev Pesach. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, you'll finish your meal, even if it's after dark. Let's say darkness, night set was 7 p.m. He can continue his meal till 8 p.m., 9 p.m., whenever it is. And then he recites Birkas HaMazon, he makes Kiddush, and that's all he has to do. Now, the question here is, okay, he makes Kiddush. Does he need a new Su'udah after Kiddush? Because the Su'udah that he terminated was a Suda that he started b'chol. It was a Sudas Chol, and he has to eat a Sudas Shabbos. But we'll see the Rashbam is of the opinion that he doesn't have to eat another meal. He simply recites Kiddush, very odd kind of Kiddush. You know, Kiddush usually is the kickoff of the meal. In this case, the Kiddush is going to be after the meal. But Dai B'Suda Shachal Kodam HaKiddush, Leichashev Kiddush B'Makom Suda, Kevon Shasuda Zunat Sheveslo Kisuda Shabbos. Very paradoxical halacha here, where he began the Suda as a Suda's Chol, he recites Kiddush at the end of the Suda, and somehow, retroactively, the Suda becomes a Suda Shabbos. Dover Mafli, Dover Pella. Now, the language of the Brisa, it starts with Mafsikin l'Shabbosos and presents Machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. But the truth is that what the Brisa has in mind when it refers to Rabbi Yossi is Mafsikin the Erev Pesach, because again, as far as Shabbos is concerned, Rabbi Yossi never accepted an Iser of Achila on Erev Shabbos. So when it speaks about Mafsikin l'Shabbos, that is true according to Rabbi Yehuda, but the Brisa mentions Rabbi Yossi insofar as the halacha of Ein Mafsika, which is Rabbi Yossi's opinion, applies on Erev Pesach. Rabbi Yossi Sovich of the Erev Shabbos Mutalas Lecha. Is kolshkein shein tzorch lahafsik vein bez a chidush that be'erev Pesach shesov Rabbi Yossi shasol lahaschil yesh chidush b'masha eno tzorch lahafsik. Now the Brisa records a story of Maisa Shahaya, Maisa Reb Shimon Gamliel, Virab Yehuda, Virab Yossi, Shaya Mesubim Bi'ako, and it was Erev Shabbos. They were eating a meal in Akko. V'kidesh or Kodesh Aleim Hayom. Now it became nightfall. So they're eating a meal on Erev Shabbos, and now it became nightfall. Amalo Reb Shimon Gamliel Reb Yossi Berebi is Kach Kara Reb Shimon Gamliel Reb Yossi Ukinui Legadol Ador. So the phrase Berebi is a phrase that you use to address a word that you use to address the Gadol Ador. With Sonchan Shenafsik, B'nechuch L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda Chavereinu. Should we stop our meal now that it's nighttime and implement the Chumrah of Rabbi Yehuda, the Isser Rabbi Yehuda of Mafsikin L'Shabbosos? Hamalo. So Rabbi Yossi turns to Rabbi Shimon and he says to him, whenever I have a disagreement with Rabbi Yehuda, you always consistently asking, like my opinion. And this is something that we find in Masechet Sukkah and elsewhere, that Omer Rav Shimon Gamliel, he askins like Rabbi Yossi, and this is consistent. And now I'm with you for a meal together on Erev Shabbos in Akko, and all of a sudden you're paskening like Rabbi Yehuda. The Achshav Atam Achaviv Divrei Rabbi Yehuda B'Bilfonai Hagam Lichbo Shesamalka Imi Babois. This is the connection between today and Purim. It seems like in here I am in front of you, and you're paskening like Rabbi Yehuda against me. Why would you do such a thing? So therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel responds to Rabbi Yossi, Kain lo nafsik. You're right, and we're not going to stop our Suda. We're not going to implement the Chumrah of Rabbi Yehuda, and lo nafsik shemi yiru talmidim. If the disciples will see what's going on, that we are mafsik this Suda, yikvu halacha l'doros, they will assume that for all generations we pass like Rabbi Yehuda. Amru, and they said, Lo zazu mishamat shekava aloch Rabbi Yossi ein mafsik. So the end of the story is that they announced, we paskin like Rabbi Yossi, and you don't stop a Suda, you continue your Suda, you make Kiddush, and you recite Birkas HaMazon, and that's it. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, please underline the word Shmuel, because that's what we're going to focus our attention on. Shmuel. Ein halacha loker Rabbi Yehuda v'loker Rabbi Yossi alapores mapo mekadesh. We don't apply the psak of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if you're eating on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif, you have to be mafsik Yesuda completely, and you have to take away the shulchan, and you have to be mevarech Birkas HaMazon. We don't pass like Rabbi Yossi, who says that you don't need any hafsak at all, but rather we have sort of a middle of the road shita l'halach, and that's called pores mapo mekadesh. What we're going to do is we're going to cover all the food, and then we're going to recite Kiddush Hayom, and then we'll continue our Seudah. Fundamentally, we're passing like Rabbi Yossi, ein mafsikin, but we need, before Kiddush, to cover the food, and then recite Kiddush. And the Mefarshim explain that Prisas Mapa, he ke'en akiras hashulchan Rabbi Yehuda. As I mentioned yesterday, the main commentary on Perek Arvei Pesachim is the Rashbam. So the Rashbam says that Prisas Mapa is a kind of Akiras HaShulchan. But that makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Shmuel apparently paskins l'halacha like Rabbi Yossi, as we said before, that you don't need a hefsek. So why do we require prisas mapa umakadish? And it would seem that even according to Rabbi Yossi, again, I'm just giving you a havamina of what might the Gemara be thinking at this point, that even Rabbi Yossi, who holds ein mafsikim, nevertheless, we do want to lechumra finish our suda before kiddush. We're going to recite kiddush inside the suda, but we need some sort of a hefsek to indicate that we are continuing our suda, but it's going to be a suda Shabbos, whereas we started the suda as a suda schol. And what is that wedge that separates between the suda Shabbos that we're about to embark upon with kiddush and the previous suda, which was a suda schol? It's prisas mapa. It's an act of being pores mapa on the food before kiddush, and all this is l'kvod Shabbos, that we should indicate that the meal that we're eating is the meal of Kedusha Shabbos, which is begun or kicked off with Kiddush. So the Gemara asks the following question on Shmuel. Eini, is this really Shmuel's opinion? Va'amar av tachlifa, bar avdimi amar Shmuel keshem shmafsikin l'Kiddush, ach mafsikin la'avdola. The Gemara now is going to prove from a different statement, a different tradition of Shmuel, that we have to be mafsik the Suda that was begun on Erev Shabbos when it gets dark and recite Kiddush, even though he started eating beheta. And how do we see that? Because he compares it to Havdalah. So here on the top of Daf Kufam and Beis, ach mafsikin le'Havdalah. According to Shmuel, if you began a meal, we call it Sudah Shlishit, on Shabbos, and now it's time for Havdalah, mafsikin. You complete the Sudah, and we make Havdalah. So they were eating on Shabbos. It's now nighttime of Motzei Shabbos. They have to stop the Sudah, and that they have to recite Havdalah. That's the Shita Shmuel. Later on, we'll see that Rav rejects the Shmuel. This sheet of Shmuel, he holds you don't need any afsak of Havdalah. Just continue your Suda and then make Havdalah. That's how we paskin. But Shmuel was of the opinion that you have to, when it gets dark on Motzei Shabbos, immediately you have to stop your Suda and bench and then recite Havdalah. So the Gemara says, "My mafsikin." What does it mean to be mafsik for Havdalah? Lav, doesn't it mean like your shulchan, that he has to remove the table so that he can recite Birkas Hamazon? And since it says here the name of Shmuel, Keshem shemafsikin lekiddush, kach mafsikin lahavdalah, it means that Kiddush requires, like Havdalah, a complete hefsek to terminate the Suda with Akiras Shulchan and Birkas Hamazon. And that reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. We're not accepting Prisas Mapa. How could it be that you quote Shmuel as saying that all we need is Prisas Mapa when we have a statement of Shmuel of Kshem Shemafsikin L'Avdolah, Kshem Shemafsikin L'Kiddush, Kach Mafsikin L'Avdolah. And that equation indicates a complete termination of the Suda, like in the case of Motzei Shabbos, so too in the case of Erev Shabbos. You start a Suda Beheter, you've got to be mafsik the Suda, that gives that Shulchan, and with Birkas Hamazon, it's not enough just to be Pores Mapa Makad. So the Gemara says, lo, that we have a psak of Shmuel like Rabbi Yehuda, you think? And that's impossible because we know Shmuel passing like Rabbi Yossi. The answer is that Rav Tachlifa bar Avdimi did not have in mind that Shmuel holds mafsikin v'akiras hashulchan, but rather lamapa. When the word mafsikin came out of the mouth of Rabbi Tachlifa, we thought it meant a full-fledged afsaka, i.e., akiras hashulchan and Birkas Hamazon. No, That's not what he meant by mafsikin. He means to create a hefsek of Pores Mapa Makadish. So one Su'uda can take on a new complexion, even though the beginning of the Suda was a Suda Chol, the end of the Suda becomes a Suda Shabbos, as long as we have this Prisus Mapa. And that sort of separates the two parts of the Suda. But your Girsa, that mafsikin means that mafsikin with a complete termination of the Suda with Akira Shulchan and Birkas Hamazon, that reflects the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel Paskin, I'm sorry, that reflects the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. And Shmuel Paskin's like Rabbi Yossi. Rabba Barav Huna, Ikla, this is an Erev Shabbos case, Lebei Reish Galusa. So he finds himself in the house of the Reish Galusa, and it's nighttime now. They came back from shul. Aisu Taka Kame. They brought the bread on the table in front of him. And what did Rabbah do? Paras Mapa Vikidesh. He did a priestess Mapa and a Kiddush, not because he had started a Suda on Erev Shabbos, but simply that's the law of every Erev Shabbos. You need priestess Mapa to be Makadish. Now, why is this so? Rashbam explains, what he wanted, Rav Huna, was that they shouldn't bring out the lechem to the shulchan before Kiddush. They should only bring it out after Kiddush. They had brought it out before Kiddush. So he needed to do Pores Mapa to cover the lechem so that it would be considered as if the lechem was not there on the shulchan, because the lechem has to be brought out to the shulchan after Kiddush. And we'll try to explain why that's so in just a minute. Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa that supports the minig of Rabba Barafuna. Ein mevin es hashulchan, meaning we don't bring the bread to the table on the Leil of Shabbos, Elam Kein Kiddush, only if he was Makadish. So the lechem should be brought out to the table after Kiddush. If they brought out the lechem before Kiddush, Hevi Pores Mapa Umakadish covers the lechem. Then he recites Kiddush. So now the question is, what's the reason that the lechem should only be brought out to the table after Kiddush? So I'll read to you a summary of the Rashbam. Tama Dov Shem Mevinus Alechem Al Shulchan Kodem HaKiddush. The Rashbam here very atypically quotes the She'iltos of one of the Gaonim, Rav Achai Gaon. Kidei Sheyireh Shesuda Zu Ba L'Chvod HaShabbos. In other words, if you bring out the lechem onto the table, there's no indication that this Suda, the lechem is the Suda, is a Suda Shabbos. And the mitzvah of Kvod Shabbos means to set up a Suda Shabbos. If you first recite Kiddush, Kiddush is, so to speak, chal on this Su'uda, such that now when you bring out the Suda, it automatically becomes a Suda Shabbos. But if the Suda was out on the table before Kiddush, it's not a Suda Shabbos. Lakach, therefore, im heviu es heviu kvar es halechem al shulchan kodesh kiddush yesh yiflos lifros halel mapa lasir leachar kiddush. We cover the lechem until after Kiddush. When we uncover the lechem, it's as if we brought it out to the table as a Suda Shabbos, because we've already recited Kiddush on this shulchan. And now the Gemara quotes two brisos regarding the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. And we're back to the discussion about eating on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yotiv. Tani Chada, we have one brisa that says, Shavin she'ein maschilin. That even Rabbi Yossi agrees to Rabbi Yehuda that you're not allowed to begin a meal on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov. As far as Hafsok is concerned, that's a different story. That's a machlokas. But as far as Maschil is concerned, we don't eat Samach L'Mincha. And the subject of this brayta is Erev Shabbos. Tanya Idach, Shavin Shemaschil. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that we begin a meal Samach L'Mincha on Erev Shabbos. So the Gemara analyzes these two brises. Bishlema Hadesanya, that brisa, the first one that we had, just Shavin, that both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda agree. She'ein Maschilin, that you don't begin your Suda, Samach L'Mincha. That's not a case of Erev Shabbos, but rather Mishkachas will be Erev Pesach. Because Rabbi Yossi agrees on the Isra Achila, Samach L'Mincha, but Dafka and only on Erev Pesach. With regard to any other Erev Yom Tov or Erev Shabbos, Rabbi Yossi says, keep eating until Chashech. But Rabbi Yossi concedes, because of the Chumrah of Matzah Doraisa, that we don't begin a meal on Erev Pesach. And that's what it means, Shavin, that there's no machloket, she'ein maschilin, that's referring to Erev Pesach. So that much I can understand. Elahad Sanya, but we had a second brisa, Shavin, Shemaschilin. Both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda agree that you can start the meal. What's that referring to? Emas. Maschilin Emas. When, under what circumstance are you allowed to begin your meal? And the Gemara says the following. If you're talking about Erev Shabbos, that can't be, because the word shavin would be inappropriate. Rabbi Yossi says that we don't begin a meal on Erev Shabbos on Miflik Polit, and Rabbi Yehuda prohibits it. So my answer is lo kasha, kan kodim tisha v'kan liachar tisha, which means the following, that the brisa that says according to everyone you're allowed to begin a meal, that's talking about Erev Shabbos, Kodem, Tisha, before the 9th hour, which is Samach L'Mincha. But Kan, this brisa that says that there's machlok that we had earlier, that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda disagree, that's on Erev Shabbos Liachar Tisha. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's also to begin a meal at that time, and according to Rabbi Yossi, it's mutter. Now the Torah says Zochar es Yom HaShabbos lekadsho, which means you have to be mekadesh al yain. And now the Gemara establishes the following: we need kiddush b'makom suda, or do we not need kiddush b'makom suda? Oh, somebody on kiddush b'beis hakneses. If you heard kiddush in the shul on the night of Shabbos, the night of Yom Tov, Amar Rav Yedei Yayin lo yotzu. As far as Birchas HaYayin is concerned, Bar Priya Gofen, they're going to have to recite another Bar Priya Gofen if they want, if they choose to drink wine at the Shabbos table at home. Because that which they heard Bar Priya Gofen in the Kiddush of Beis HaKnesses, that's not going to help them for the Yayin that they want to drink at home. But, says Rav, Yedei Chovas Kiddush, Yotze. They don't need another Kiddush. And if they don't want to drink wine, they don't have to drink wine. They already yotze the mitzvah kiddush in shul. Ushmuel Omar. And here we'll turn to Daf Kuf Aleph. Af yedei kiddush lo yotzu. Shmuel holds tzarich lekadish b'makom suda, as we'll soon see. And therefore, the kiddush that he recited in shul does not fulfill the mitzvah of kiddush at home. And any kiddush they recite in shul, that'll help those who are eating in the shul, the orchim, but it's not going to help anyone who has to go home, because the kiddush has to be b'makom su'uda. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop for today on the top of Daf Kuf Aleph Amid Aleph. Have a great day.